So, in the latest episode of Yellowjackets, in present day, the ladies start to experiment with some of Charlotte's different therapy methods. And in the past, everyone's dealing with Shauna losing her baby, and also Misty's dealing with the perception, both in the past and the present, of who she is, especially beyond someone who's just trying to help. Starting as always in the past, when it comes to Misty, she's dealing with mixed reactions to how she handled the Shauna delivery. On one hand, there's people like Akila who recognize that Misty is a little weird, but at the very least, she's doing what others won't. Ben wasn't trying to get involved. Akila had limited information and nobody else was really trying to step up, but Misty did, even though she had a moment when she freaked out. But on the other hand, Mari's the type who doesn't forget the fact that Misty cut off Ben's leg, well, part of his leg, that has always been a little bit weird, and this whole scenario is just, while some like Akila may want to give her props, at the same time her being able to do this and do this without really flinching too much is something that should be a red flag. And then when you add in the whole Crystal thing and her feeling that she's not doing enough to try to find Crystal, or at least make a big deal of Crystal being missing, this leads Misty to once Shauna's situation, gets talked about a little bit, to advocate for Crystal being found. But originally, she was just doing it as a defense, just so that people cannot accuse her of doing anything. But as some of the girls there was two girls who I don't think have even been named yet, as they were talking about possibly finding Crystal and eating her, that's when Misty really kicked in the gear to make sure that she didn't get eaten, that if anything she'll get a proper burial, maybe get cremated, who knows. But when she couldn't find Crystal because maybe Crystal walked off, or maybe a bear, wolf, whatever got to her first. It's the middle of winter, the bears will be hibernating. But anyway, when she didn't find Crystal, she ends up going back to the cliff and she finds Ben, who pretty much is at that point where he'd rather die than actually stick around. And it's so bad that Misty starts fighting him with saying that she's gonna tell everybody. Misty is willing to, just to keep him alive, confess to everybody that he's gay, that if they ever get back, he's gonna say that he was the one who fathered Shauna's baby, that he tried to get them all pregnant. And Ben is at that point where he does not care. In a flashback sequence, or else a dream sequence, he sees Paul walking out on him, so with that it seems like he's given up hope, and he even asked Misty to push him since he's coming to that point where he's right on the cliff but he can't do it. But Misty, she's just unable to, and she breaks down crying because between feeling a bit guilty about Shauna losing her baby, the Crystal situation, and now Ben trying to put on her this murder or else a suicide situation, it's too much. And we see a very vulnerable Misty break down to the point where, even though Ben and her have had a very weird relationship, he decides, for the sake of her sanity and mental health, he'll just deal with his feelings and maybe at another time try to off himself. Switch it over to Shauna. With Jackie's corpse gone and eaten, Thaisa now part of Lottie's camp, and her not really being close to Natalie, Shauna kind of feels isolated and alone in a way that makes her a bit violent. Pretty much on sight, she decides to deck Misty when Misty comes back from searching for Crystal. And at the same time, she's starting to throw accusations about everybody trying to eat her baby because of those visions that she had. And Charlotte steps in not to stop Shauna, but rather to give her an outlet. She allows herself to get beat into a pulp to the point where you almost think that Shauna might have knocked out Lottie with all the decks and some type of hammer punch, but I can't remember what it's called. But either way, Shauna's face looks like she's been through some type of machine by the time Shauna is done with her. But thankfully, it seems getting to beat the hell out of somebody calms Shauna, and while Lottie's followers are freaking out a bit afterwards, at the same time they let it happen and watch. So I guess they agreed with Lottie that Shauna needed this, and in order for them all to survive, they needed Shauna to be able to process her grief, process her anger, and maybe this was the only way to possibly do it. Jumping to modern times, being that everyone's at Charlotte's camp, and she wants them to not just have like a little reunion, but really make use of their time there, she decides to push on all of them to do some therapy. Only a few of them actually do therapy or get the idea of what they're trying to, or rather what Lottie wants them to try to obtain. But some, like Van, they just never mind it. Even though from what Van tells Thaisa, she has late stage cancer and probably has months to live, so a little bit of therapy wouldn't probably been that bad for her. But at the same time, Thaisa, when it comes to her therapy, and that's just using like a makeup brush to like brush up on, it doesn't work for her either. Instead, what works for her is talking to Lottie about her sleepwalking, her fears of that demon coming back, or rather that other self. And since Lottie kind of gave her some form of help back in the wilderness, Lottie is trying to still do that, but instead of having Thaisa fear this other entity or even try to suppress it, she tries to get her to embrace it. And the reason why is because Lottie has some connection to the wilderness herself, as seen by her having a therapy session with that antler thing, and it seems increasingly she's trying to embrace what she once saw as the dark side, or what she might have saw as some kind of evil. And in her journey, it seems she's trying to help Thaisa on hers, even though Lottie is still a bit confused and maybe even scared about how to proceed going forward. Switching over to Shauna, she is tasked with her therapy to take care of a goat, and we learn from her trying to care for this goat that one of the main issues that she has is the fear that when it comes to getting close to anybody or anything, that it's going to end up dying because of her, or maybe around her. And you can stem this from all the things that happened in the past, including the death of her first child, up to now where she outright says, either to Misty or to Lottie, that her fear is that if she got close to Callie, either something bad would happen to her, or as we saw with Shauna kind of daydreaming that her son was alive for a couple of days, if not weeks, that she would come to realize that Callie isn't real and then have to deal with the pain of that. Hence why sometimes it can seem that Callie and Shauna's relationship is odd, and that's just because in order to protect her heart, Shauna has been starving Callie of the relationship that maybe at one time Callie desperately wanted and needed. And speaking of desperately wanted and needed, Misty really is iffy about this whole therapy thing like most of them are, but when she goes to find somebody, go out in the wilderness and avoid being in a deprivation tank, she finds Shauna, and Shauna reminds us of how a lot of people see her in terms of she's not only weird, but even though Shauna and Natalie and the rest of them, grew up together and also were in the wilderness together, they also other Misty. Even now, Misty seemed like a whole other level of murderous, crazy, whatever you want to call it. And Misty takes offense to that. Her goal has always been to take care of her friends, show her value, create some kind of purpose in their life, and she keeps getting rejected left and right, no matter how much she tries or how genuine she tries to express how she feels about them. So with this in mind, she decides to do the she decides to do the noise, sound, sight deprivation tank, and during this, she sees Caligula dancing with Walter, and Caligula gives her the type of feedback that she's needed, and you could even say the validation that she's needed in terms of just the recognition that she's a closer. She does things others won't so things can get done. And with hearing that, she decides to call Walter, since she sees the dream of him being in there and everything, that maybe this could be the person who fixes her desperation for love, since unlike Natalie, unlike Shauna, unlike Thaisa and others, he seems to appreciate her crazy, even embraces it in a way. So why not embrace him back, I think is the idea with her. Which leads to the end of the day for everybody, where because Natalie's been really into the therapy, even if some of the more out there stuff is not her thing, she wants everybody to kind of reflect a bit, talk about what happened, and nobody's into that. Van brought some alcohol along, so the idea is let's drink, let's have a fun reunion, rather than talk about our feelings and issues and all that. And this leads to some fun moments, like when Misty's being teased about Walter, or even Natalie being outed for sleeping with Kevin. But it also gets a bit dark as the topic of how much they remember of the wilderness is brought up, and how a lot of people seem to have blocked out a lot of things that happened. And even Charlotte, perhaps feeling a bit triggered by seeing the wilderness entity and then all these ladies together, she tries to push them out, but in the end she just ends up joining them. But the fun times end when Jeff calls to let them know that Adam's body has been found, and with that it seems the bubble that these ladies were making for themselves has been popped. So when it comes to highlights, the first one for me has to be Lottie. And both past and present, Lottie has shown herself to be someone who's willing to take on the issues of others. But in the past, I feel like when it came to her taking all those hits, it had multiple reasons behind it. You can look at it as her being so numb before the plane crash happened, and she was dealing with her parents' fears and premonitions, that now with her not being on all these drugs to numb her, she wants to feel something now. And beyond feeling the cold, she wants to kind of feel some kind of pain as well, just to know that she is truly alive, rather than still this sort of zombie thanks to all these pills and that her parents put on. But at the same time, because Shauna lived but the baby died, I think a part of her also wants to be punished in a way. For if she's gonna be this leader who's has all this faith that these people have in her, especially in terms of keeping them alive, to not be able to save a baby, I think that kind of made her feel a little bit like an imposter. And granted, Sean is not one of her followers, probably never will be one of her followers, but at the same time, she failed her. And with that, being hurt that thoroughly by Shauna is the only way she can potentially feel absolved of her failure. At least that's how I took it. The second highlight deals with how Misty is shown this episode, both in the past and the present. I think too often we forget that Misty hasn't really had the best life. She's mostly been alone, isolated, and when she wasn't isolated alone, she had to always push herself into a situation, show her value, and seek out validation, whether it's from helping Ben with the team as some type of assistant, or when it came to being in the wilderness, she had to push herself beyond what might have actually been her original comfort zone so that they could survive. And granted, she's the one that made it so that they got stuck in the wilderness, but let's push that aside for now. The point is, because Ben has become a bit useless, either due to him not being able to move quickly, or just him saying I'm not doing this, she has often had to take on a role that he would be expected to. And with that in mind, so come the double-edged sword. She's someone that a lot of the girls rely upon, but as Mari's shown, it leads to her not getting the benefit of the doubt of not being somebody who's crazy, psycho, and I would even say they kind of stripped her of her femininity in a way. At least in a way that, like, take Ben and him attempting to unalive, suicide, whatever wording we're using nowadays. Him deciding to even ask Misty to push him, I think for her that was a bit of a breaking point. An accidental death like Crystal's, an accidental death like Shauna's baby is one thing, but Ben saying that she's capable of killing him by pushing him asking that of her as if that's not going to affect her in any kind of way, and then her being pushed into another situation where she has to beg somebody to give her like just common decency. That's what led to having a breakdown. And then when you jump, what is it, 20, 30 some odd years in the future, and she's still dealing with the same stuff where she has to go beyond just to get some sense of belonging. And then even with her doing that stuff, you have people like Shauna that want to ostracize and other her. You can see why when she's in that sensory deprivation tank, she sees Walter and her bird dancing around and kind of having this weird moment. Because after all this trauma, that's what's normal to her. The idea of her bird talking to her, Walter, who she just met, dancing around in a top hat. And granted, she likes musicals, so that's also a factor, but I just think the further we get into season 2, the more the past is reflecting the future and vice versa, and that's what's causing a lot of these characters to become much more notable, memorable, and is also pushing away the idea that especially came early on with this season that we may be experiencing a sophomore slump. Case in point with Natalie. Even though past Natalie has kind of fell off a bit, to be honest, present day Natalie, as she transforms from a burnout to being an advocate for healing, she has a very interesting development going on. Which I say without a hint of sarcasm, since it's been a long time and I was just purely critical about Natalie. But at this point, between her relationship with Lisa, her advocating for the rest of the ladies to really do something about their issues rather than suppress it, drink it away, or whatever, it's really making you wonder, is this going to be how Natalie is going forward? Or, as I feared and said in the last episode, is this just a setup so that when she hits a new rock bottom, it's going to be because of something traumatic happening to her again? Whether it's Lisa getting hurt or dying, or perhaps something else happening. The last highlight to me is the wilderness entity with the horns. Not necessarily having a proper introduction, but at the very least being shown either in the form of like Thais's alternate when it comes to Charlotte, or just the idea of what this entity may mean. Like, everybody keeps questioning how the hell did Charlotte get out of a mental hospital, and so comes the question of maybe this entity was involved. Did it take over Charlotte so it can get her out? Was there a possibility that this entity, even though we're assuming there's some kind of spirit, ghost, or maybe voice in her head, that maybe in some way it can manifest different things? Because as we saw in the wilderness, certain things did happen that definitely would raise an eyebrow, but whether there's a logical explanation for it or not is hard to say, since with that symbol and all this occult stuff, there's always a possibility. Never mind, when you go into Thais's family history, we know ghosts, demons, or whatever exists, at least in this universe. So when it comes to this entity, who has gone from the wilderness to now being in New York with Charlotte, so comes the question, are we now going to finally start getting some answers now that the entity has properly introduced itself, or at least was seen outside of in previews? Overall, when it comes to Yellowjackets, I feel at this point we're definitely rebounding from the sort of iffy episodes that started off the season, and as the modern day characters start to match up with the past, we're going to definitely have quite a few good final episodes, and hopefully with the way this show is going, it can find a way to resolve the Adam storyline without making it seem like they're just sweeping it under the rug, because it clearly isn't working.